Welcome everyone to this session. It's on herring, called Herring Synthesis, Linking Local and Traditional Knowledge, History and Science to Understand Ecological Changes in the Fishery. And just a comment about background. I think I've been to every clan conference. I remember I was at the first one, and Andy Hope invited me, and I was pleased to be there, but I didn't really know very much. But I did a presentation on the relationship between natural and cultural resources, and I still see myself as continuing to do that. And probably this session is the most natural resource oriented of any of the sessions, but I think nobody would disagree that herring is a very, very important cultural resource. And in addition to harvesting herring, people dance herring, they sing herring, and they weave herring, and that's what the chilkat blanket is there, the Kiksadi blanket. I took that photograph in 1996, I think, when the pole was raised at Sitka National Historical Park, and symbolizes herring rock, which is a at'u of the Kiksadi. So herring are very important culturally and as a natural resource, and so they're definitely worth focusing on. So what we're going to do today is I want to tell you about this collaborative interdisciplinary project at the beginning, give you a little bit of an overview about what we're trying to do in understanding herring. Then I'm going to give it over to Madonna Moss, who's also on the project, and her team of archaeologists, who will present a little archaeological overview of herring, and then to Fritz Funk, who's a retired biologist with Department of Fish and Game, who's going to talk about the impacts of early commercial fishing and herring reduction plants on herring fisheries. And then we're going to go across the North Pacific to Japan and hear from Shingo Hamada, who is just beginning his PhD work on herring on the other side of the pond, as it were, and some of the connections that exist through the Sakura fishery and so on with Japan. And then finally, the session will culminate with what I'm calling an elders panel, and I see two of the three we invited are here. Ethel Makinen is here, along with Roby Littlefield, and also Harold Martin is here, and Clarence Jackson may be joining us. We'll have to see, but there'll be plenty to talk about, I think. All right, so with that, let me begin. So we all know what a herring looks like. We know something about their distribution, which is symbolized there on the red lines. And they extend basically from Baja, California, all the way up the North Pacific to the Bering Sea, and then down Siberian coast to Japan, actually as far as North China. And what's everybody agrees on is that they're absolutely foundational to the marine food web. They're a critical source of food for all major species, almost all major species that people like to eat or catch or whatever. This little chart from the from Fisheries and Oceans Canada shows the percentage of the diet that herring makes up in various seabirds, salmon, bottom fish, and marine mammals. And a couple of species that are left out are whales, of course, for which they're a major feed, and human beings. But it can be said that 50 to 70% of herring fall to predation, and obviously, as a rich, nutritious species, they are very important to the marine food chain. And as one of our consultants said on the project, herring is the feed for everything. Now, I think historically people sort of took herring as a given. It was always there in quantity. It was a kind of superabundant. You couldn't exhaust it. It seemed inexhaustible. And historical pictures like this one from the State Library is taken around the turn of the century, supposedly at Douglas Beach, although I used to live about 100 yards from Douglas Beach. I never saw herring like this on Douglas Beach. But it gives you a sense of the quantity of herring that used to be around the Juneau area and elsewhere in southeast Alaska. And one of the comments that we heard in our 71 interviews and focus groups that we've done in various communities around Southeast Alaska over the last year and a half with this herring synthesis project is that you could hear herring. They were so bountiful. And a common comment was like this one from Harvey Kitka and Sitka. It used to sound like rain when they're feeding. You'll look at the bay and it's just a mass of herring feeding. And then that's bookended by comments like the one we got at a Ketchikan focus group where the whole region is becoming a kind of ocean desert. You just don't see quantities of herring anymore. So that's really the impetus for this project. You might say this is an ethnographically grounded project. The problem is really one that's defined by local and traditional knowledge. And in fact, it was first defined clearly for me by Herman Kitka when he taught with me here at the University of Alaska Southeast in 1996. When we came to talking about non-salmon fish, he focused on herring and made a number of observations about herring in the Sitka area. And this is what he said. One, the herring stock is being depleted. The spawning areas are shrinking. Spawning periods are becoming shorter. Herring spawners are themselves becoming smaller. And too much of the spawning stock is taken by the Sacro fishery in Sitka Sound. That was his major concern. And it seemed to me at the time that all of these were testable hypotheses. In other words, they're things that could be investigated through a combination of science and local and traditional knowledge. And so it took a while to kind of design a project to look at this, but that's essentially what we've done in this project. And then we got the funding from the North Pacific Research Board in 2007 to go forward with it. But we kind of converted those observations, which we'd gotten from Herman Kitka, but from other people as well, into a set of hypotheses, working hypotheses, you might call them. And one of them is that Alaska is managing essentially what are depleted herring stocks in some areas. And contemporary factors are preventing those stocks from rebounding to healthy levels. And in the case of the Sitka Sound Sacro fishery, perhaps adversely impacting subsistence herring egg fisheries and other species dependent on herring. A second one was that herring became depleted in many areas by the mid-20th century, really before statehood and before active management by the contemporary Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And it's from this shifted baseline that the state measures its success. And also that discrete spawning populations are now managed as single stocks, but maybe they were at one time separate stocks, or maybe still are separate stocks. And then a third idea is that the maintenance of diverse spawning locations and habitat is critical to conserving interspecies biodiversity. And we're not sure we can test all of these, but we've tried to synthesize both historical information as well as interviewing local people who've had a long history of interaction with the herring fisheries to try to assess these. Our methods were essentially what I would describe as historical ecology. We did, as I said, 60 plus interviews plus several focus groups in communities, trying to build a historical and spatial database in order to identify historical herring spawning and massing areas, to link changes in those spawning areas to environmental factors or human factors in the socio-ecological system, and then third, to identify sensitive areas for protection and perhaps even potential restoration of herring spawning. Just a few observations about traditional knowledge. We call it local and traditional knowledge because that's what the North Pacific Research Board funding agency calls it. But some people call it traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge. They're all sort of synonymous terms. But a good working definition of that is the cumulative body of knowledge handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings with one another and their environment. And in the case of herring, you find that there's intergenerational transmission of knowledge about herring through stories, through observations, and most importantly, through engagement in the various herring fisheries. Also, there's transmission through networks of production, networks of distribution, and even consumption. Herring eggs are often consumed in community events. If you ever go to Sitka, or even to the A&B Hall today, if you went there for lunch, I had herring eggs on neh, the thin seaweed. And that's very typical that they be eaten in communal events. And all of these networks provide a means of transmitting knowledge about herring. And the one that always amazes me is the distribution network, because the amount of herring eggs that leaves Sitka and goes not just to Southeast Alaska, but all over the state, the West Coast, even as far as Washington, D.C., where I once got a box, a 50-pound box. It's a pretty impressive distribution network. And then finally, a lot of the knowledge, I think, depends on what fishery you're in, what technology, and how much time you've spent. And of course, one of the technologies that people know of is the herring rake. There's a picture in the top corner there. That was sort of symbolic of the abundance of herring that used to exist. You could just rake them up and get as many as you need for bait or for your own use. Now, very few people, in fact, we couldn't find one who's actively using a herring rake to harvest herring, because the distribution really isn't conducive to using a herring rake. Also, other technologies have changed. So, for example, we find people who are in the bait fisheries that really know herring through their depth sounders and their fish finders, more so than by personal observation. And then, of course, the time spent in the fishery. In places like Sitka, in the olden days, used to have a much longer duration of spawning, but even before spawning, people were out raking herring in order to eat them fresh or to produce oil and whatnot. So they weren't just a resource for herring spawn. They were used really throughout the year, or at least from spring right on through summer and fall in various ways. So there was a lot of contact historically with the resource in order to observe it. Now, the main fisheries, there's a number of different fisheries, and I'm not going to talk about them all, but the main source of knowledge for the people we talk to is subsistence herring roe fisheries. A lot of the people we talk to participated in harvesting herring eggs or consuming them throughout their lives, or portion of their lives. And just to give you a little background on that, in the 19th century, it's written, at least in one source, it may be a slight exaggeration, that there were actually 20,000 natives in Sitka for the herring harvest each spring. And if it's even half of that, that's a good portion of the native population in the region coming to Sitka to partake in that harvest. So it was obviously a very, very big deal. Today, it's still a big deal. You have 97% of Sitka native households still using herring eggs, not harvesting, but using them. And you have hundreds of thousands of pounds taken on hemlock branches, about 177 pounds per native household taken. Very significant. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm just going to give you a few interesting things that we found. I'm not going to try to summarize all the data because we have a lot to cover. But one of the interesting things that traditional knowledge supplies is names for things. And we heard from several different sources, one in Sitka, Herman Kitka, another Clara Paratovich in Klawock, that seagulls actually named herring. Significantly, when seagulls are around herring and they start eating herring, their sound changes. I've often thought that seagulls were named onomatopoetically because Keitladi sounds like Keitladi, kind of sounds like a seagull. But then when they start eating herring, sometimes they sound very satisfied, and you'll hear a Yaaw. And so what we heard is that's how herring were named. It was the seagulls that named them. Then you have a number of origin stories, some of them going back to Raven. This one comes from the Haida, but the short of it is that Raven found herring dancing in their house below. He tried to harvest them on something that's called Raven's mustache, which was probably eelgrass, and they spawned on it, but when he ate the spawn on eelgrass, he found it bitter, so he stuck in hemlock branches instead, and that's how people started gathering herring on hemlock branches. Then in Hoona, I won't go through this whole thing, but people evidently discovered herring when they came out of Glacier Bay for the first time up in the head of Port Frederick at a place called Nika Bay. And the way the oral history was conveyed by Lily White in Hoona, she said they were virtually starving when they came upon them, and they saw that it looked milky, and they put branches in and they harvested herring eggs, and that was the first time they did it, and it was a kind of desperate means to avoid starvation, and so herring saved the day, basically. Then in Sitka, you have stories about Herring Rock, which if you go to the community house, a portion of it is still sitting there, and the blanket tells the story. And I don't know if there's a Kiksati that wants to tell that, but if we have time later on, we certainly welcome that. The herring life cycle is pretty well documented through scientific studies. This chart from Evelyn Brown, which again I won't summarize, but just talks about the stages of the life cycle. You start out with the fertilized eggs. Oh, that doesn't work. Use your gun. You start out with the fertilized eggs, and then you move over to the larval stage for about 2 months, then to juveniles, and then to the adults, and then back around to spawning again. And at each stage of the life cycles, herring have various vulnerabilities, various habitats. And one of the things I thought we could do in this study is try to really document things at all stages of the life cycle. But in fact, most of the information we have is in the spawning period. And in a way that's predictable because people are very actively engaged with herring at the time of spawning. So I would say the vast majority of our traditional knowledge that we documented concerns adults, spawning schools, and spawning behavior of herring. Although we did get some interesting observations about larval stage and some vulnerabilities that hadn't seen documented elsewhere in the record. And just a couple of observations. Tlingit and herring is about to spawn. It actually occurs by the growth of our plants. Some people say it's when Yana 8 or cow's parsnip starts to develop. Others point to skunk cabbage. And then when the plants start to grow, then you get that first big minus tide. The moon is huge. It increases the propagation of herring, and so there's actually, you get a place all milky, and the herring just they start spawning. And then after they spawn, comes a big westerly breeze, and there's actually a Tlingit name for that breeze, and Al Martin was the person who talked about it. It's called the wind of the washing of the spawn, or Tluk-iti usk. And I don't know if you've heard that before, Ethel, but that's something that biologists don't have a name for. Al pointed out to us, but Tlingits knew that that was a way that the herring got sort of blown back out to sea. Okay, some other things we found out was that even though herring are super abundant, there was a certain territorial control that was exercised over herring, including territorial monitoring. The figure in Klawock they call a watchman. Then there was processes of trying to quiet spawning areas in order to, so we say, smooth the way for spawning to happen. And this was documented especially in the Klawock area, where you were instructed after the age of motorboats to cut your motor a couple of 100 yards away from the spawning area and row slowly in without making a lot of noise. And if you didn't do that, well, then you could be punished by the watchman. And they were very strict about it. And then there were procedures for motioning in the herring, laying your branches a certain way so the herring kind of feel like they're following a path into spawning. Again, that was something that was documented in Klawock. And then in Sitka, some people told us that they make an effort to target non-reproductive eggs. In other words, when herring spawn, if they spawn too far up on the beach or too deep below the low tide line, those eggs typically aren't viable, but they still make good eating. And so there was an effort, at least by some people, to lay their eggs in that zone where they wouldn't survive anyway, or to pick eggs from the zone where they wouldn't survive anyway, so you actually wouldn't hurt the spawning population. So these are all, I would say, traditional knowledge that contributed to the conservation of herring. But probably the most important thing we documented, and this was in all different communities, was the transplantation of herring. And these are just various quotes, which I don't have time to go through, but suffice it to say that there were highly developed techniques for moving herring spawn around to different areas so that they would take or be revitalized in places where people had come to expect them or thought that they would do well. Okay? So this is what you might call indigenous aquaculture in action, and I think one of the exciting things about the study is that it seems like this worked in the past and maybe could work to restore herring spawning areas in Southeast Alaska. And then something else we documented were sanctions for improper harvest, and lots of stories about this. Okay? So even though herring were abundant, people were really careful about how they were treated, particularly around spawning. Now in the present days, herring are managed as commercial fishing stocks, essentially, and these are the major areas. And Fish and Game has documented spawning areas at various times. Even back in territorial days, there were a few flyover surveys. And one of the things we've done is taken those original surveys at various points, and they're represented up here by the yellow lines. Anyway, the yellow lines. And then we added areas that people said herring had spawned historically. So those are represented by the green lines. And so one of the things you can see here is that we've added a lot of lines to the map. There are lots of areas that were previously not documented where people have told us herring used to spawn. Maybe not in great quantity, maybe not at commercial levels, but there was spawn activity there in the past. And many of those places, there is no longer spawning activity. So there's been major changes according to this information. And the other thing we're trying to do is correlate in a GIS database every observation with a time period and with a specific observation of what happened, okay? And so all of the red triangles on the map on this side represent observations of decline or changes in the fishery. So that's a big part of our synthesis task, is just to take all of these traditional knowledge observations and try to put them together and see what they show. But certainly we see that there's used to be a lot of spawning areas in Southeast Alaska. Okay, the impact of reduction plants, Fritz is going to talk about, so I'm going to skip that and just go to the results. In writing up the study, we have about 700 pages of interviews so far for this, from the transcripts. And we're trying to figure out, going back to the hypothesis, has there been a shift in the baseline of herring, and if so, how much? What caused the shift? Was it a single factor? A lot of people point to overfishing, but it seems like a number of factors have been involved according to our interviews and focus groups. What herring stocks might be most vulnerable and why? How can the adverse impacts to stocks and spawning be mitigated? And which herring stocks might be most conducive to restoration? These are all questions we're interested in pursuing. And then obviously the big question is, how can traditional knowledge, local traditional knowledge, help us better understand the historical ecology of fisheries, and how can it be better incorporated into the management? Okay. And these are some of the factors that I'm just listing them that people have identified as contributing to declines in herring stocks. And then finally, I'll end in Sitka, where they annually have a dinner to honor the herring right about this time of year. I don't know if they've had it yet. But one of the things that I heard said at last year's dinner by John Littlefield, whose wife is here, Roby. He said, we're just trying to protect something for our house. I think that's a very common sentiment towards herring by Tlingit communities. They really see it as the foundation of the marine house, and you have to have a certain baseline in order to have salmon fisheries, to have marine mammals, to have a healthy marine ecosystem. Okay, so with that, I'll stop and introduce our next speaker, which is Madonna Moss. And Madonna is going to summarize the archaeological component of the herring synthesis project.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for being here. The Pacific herring of Southeast Alaska are best known today as the source of the sacro prized by Asian markets. In March of every year in Sitka, under the watchful eye of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, herring egg development is monitored closely before the fleet of herring seiners and gill netters rush to catch as much as they can before the quota is reached. The purse seines of herring are too heavy to be lifted onto boats, so the herring are vacuumed on board from the nets. The herring are then transferred to tenders and then onto Japanese freighters. In Japan, the roe is removed from the females, and the rest of the fish carcasses, along with all the males, are ground into fish meal. In this way, the commercial sacro industry removes herring from the ecosystem before they can consummate the most important milestone in their life cycle, reproduction. Today I'm going to start by talking about Tlingit use of herring. Then I'll describe the role of zooarchaeology in Tom Thornton's herring synthesis project. Then I'll illustrate some of the challenges of recovering herring bones from archaeological sites. I'll then present the results of our literature review and data compilation and talk about some specific sites. The sacro fishery of today is not a good analog for the way that Tlingit and Haida people have fished for herring for thousands of years. The springtime importance of herring spawning was a critically important time for Tlingit use, but it was not the only time of year that people took herring. The Tlingit and their ancestors did harvest herring eggs from subtidal eelgrass beds or from hemlock branches and kelp they strategically placed in the intertidal zone. But the Tlingit took herring during other seasons for meat and oil, and this is lucky for us as archaeologists because otherwise there would be no bones for us to recover archaeologically. Another fact is that the Tlingit and other Northwest Coast groups did not focus exclusively on herring during the spawn. The spectacular phenomenon of herring spawning attracted a host of other animals, including gulls, ducks, geese, and crows. Salmon, other fish, seals, and sea lions are also drawn to the herring that aggregate in the spring. While spawning occurs fairly quickly, it is an event that concentrates a variety of species, all animals of interest to Tlingit fishers. In some places, people took advantage of this massing behavior and tried to extend it in time to permit a wide range of animals to be harvested. Here are Steve Langdon and archaeologist Greg Monks at the Deep Bay Stone Fish Trap on Vancouver Island. In describing how the Coast Salish used this trap to catch herring, Monks has called the strategy prey as bait. By retaining herring in a stone trap, the Coast Salish of Deep Bay were able to take not just herring, but all the other species that prey upon the herring. And in this map, you can see Vancouver Island and Deep Bay. That side I just showed is in red, and Comox Bay is just north of it in green. This is where Nancy Green has mapped large heart-shaped fish traps that seem to have been designed to catch herring based on the bones found in the sites on shore. The Comox traps are quite similar to those at 4 sites near Petersburg, mapped by Chuck Mobley and Mark McCallum. These authors have called these double lead and enclosure fish traps and have suggested they might have been used to catch herring. The rock traps, right. And here's a map in which you can see the double leads. Maybe we can, let's see. Oh, I can't see where this is showing up. Oh, well, okay, you can see the double leads of rocks, 2 lines going into what is a heart-shaped stone trap. In addition to early spring, schools of herring congregate in later spring and summer and are preyed upon by other fish. And this is the same illustration, coincidentally, that Tom was using. Although their abundance can be temporary, dip netting herring during these times could be very effective. Herring were eaten as fresh food, but also used as bait as they are today. The illustration on the right shows the important role herring plays in the diets of an array of other fish species. And as you can see, they make up over 50% of the diet of the lingcod, the Chinook salmon, the coho salmon, Pacific halibut, and a pretty high percentage of these other species as well, although this is for Vancouver Island. During the fall, the fat content of herring is at its highest in its annual cycle. Herring rakes were used to gather thousands of herring from which the oil was rendered. Favorite Bay near Angoon is a famous locality for harvesting herring. And this is where many Tlingit were staying in late October 1882 when the U.S. Navy bombarded Angoon. An eyewitness to these events, Billy Jones, describes how Angoon residents were putting up the fall run of herring and rendering the oil at the time the gunboats came to Angoon. In Jones's words, quote, "They left us homeless on the beach." We see that for the Tlingit, past and present, herring were important not just for eggs, but for eggs, meat, oil, and bait. We also see that herring were important resources used throughout much of the seasonal cycle, from March through the spring and summer and into October for as many as 8 months of the year. Our role in the Herring Synthesis Project has been to study past herring distribution and abundance using zooarchaeology. Our work has 3 main parts. In the first phase, we've created a database summarizing current knowledge of zooarchaeological records from Southeast Alaska. Information for herring and other animals has been compiled from all archaeological reports, including Forest Service and contract reports that are not widely distributed. We are reviewing the entire faunal record, that of all animal remains, so we can consider how Tlingit, Haida, and their ancestors relied on broader food webs and how these strategies may have varied over time and space. The second phase of the project will involve close analysis of faunal records to identify temporal and spatial trends in herring and other animal records. We hope to be able to link trends with environmental changes and also cultural changes in settlement patterns, social organization, and technology. A final part of the project will incorporate the archaeological herring records into the Herring Synthesis GIS being developed based on the traditional and local ecological knowledge and the historic catch and herring resource records. The main challenge to archaeological recovery of herring bones is that they're quite small. In Southeast Alaska, adult herring can reach a length of 38 centimeters. Tom, you had a figure that was even larger than that, or 15, maybe 18 inches. But most herring are smaller, usually less than 30 centimeters long. And this is not a herring fish skeleton specifically, it's a generic fish skeleton. But in terms of the jaws, the lower jaw, the dentary, and the premaxilla, if you can imagine me as a herring, premaxilla and the dentary, these jaws are, do preserve archaeologically. They don't have teeth. Their herring cranial and pectoral bones are light and thin and typically fragment into small pieces. While some cranial and pectoral bones are paired elements occurring in pairs, others occur singly. The most numerous elements in any fish are the vertebra, rays, and spines. Rays and spines are generally not diagnostic to species, however, so the herring vertebra is the most abundant and readily identified element. Here are some examples of paired elements. These are herring angulars that fit right behind the lower jawbone. And the one at the top is the archaeological specimen, and the two at the bottom are from our comparative collection at the U of O. And here's an example of an archaeological ceratahyle on the top, and the comparative collection ceratahyle and epihyle still articulated on the bottom. So you can see that you can get decent preservation of some of these cranial bones. And I have to say, this is my favorite herring bone type, these two types of bones. They're called prootics and pterotics, and they have little spheres in the center. They're just very interesting bones. These are pterotics and prootics from the head, on top, archaeological ones, and the ones on the bottom are from comparative collection. And that little round sphere does preserve archaeologically, and you can just spot, when you learn how to recognize these things, they just jump out at you. Herring vertebrae are the most commonly identified bones. While the hemal and neural spines usually break off, vertebral centra are often found intact. The number of vertebrae in a herring varies by geographic region, but ranges from 46 to 55 per individual. Here are a few herring bones that have retained their spines, but more typically they're found broken off. When the herring skeleton is disarticulated, the elements break down into fragments, and the individual bones are very small and can fall through the screens archaeologists use while excavating if the mesh size is too large. Although herring bones can be recovered by sharp-eyed screeners using quarter-inch mesh, which is in the lower right here, most herring bones will fall through quarter-inch mesh screens. Screens with mesh sizes of 1/8 inch or 2 millimeter are needed to ensure the recovery of herring bones. And these are not screens we use in excavation. They're about 8 or 9 inches in diameter. These are the screens that we use in the lab. But you can see the screen sizes here, and the screen on the top is the only one that has caught the herring bones in this particular sample. So quarter inch is way too big, even 1/8 inch, or this is close to 1/8 inch to the lower left. And I'm going to show you a closer view of that 2 millimeter mesh screen. And hopefully you can see the herring bones. This is just a closer view of that 2 millimeter mesh. And I had 70 vertebrae that I had pulled from a bulk sample, and I put them through the screen, and still a couple dozen fell through this 2 millimeter mesh. So you can see that they are pretty small. And archaeologists need to use these kind of screens to be able to recover them. Obviously, the screen size we use affects the relative abundance of species found in an archaeological site. Here's an example from the Kaufman Cove Ferry Terminal site. In the sample screen in the field with a quarter-inch mesh, we did recover herring bones, but only 3% of the fish bones were herring. In the bulk samples processed in the lab, which is the lower pie chart, 65% of the fish bones are herring. And so you can see the difference in that bright blue up at the top versus the bottom. Early excavations in southeast Alaska, before and into the 1970s, were done without any screening of site sediments, so that if herring bones are not reported, it does not necessarily mean that they were not present. The same is true for any excavation that has not used screens at least as fine as 1/8 inch mesh. Most excavations, even in the 21st century, employ quarter-inch screens, even though these are inadequate for herring bone recovery. To compensate for this, some of us take bulk samples, typically 2 liters up to 1 gallon in volume, in which all the archaeological deposit is recovered, and then this material is sorted and analyzed in the lab under controlled conditions. Such bulk samples then provide a more adequate indication of herring abundance. As of March 2009, there are over 2,800 archaeological sites recorded in southeast Alaska, as described by Mark McCallum this morning. As part of Tom's herring synthesis project, Virginia Butler and Tate Elder of Portland State University and I have reviewed all excavation reports from Southeast Alaska. This review involves study of 66 reports, of which 22 were published and 44 were in the unpublished gray literature. We thank Forest Service archaeologists for sharing their unpublished project reports with us. This map shows the spatial distribution of the sites we examined in Southeast Alaska. The red triangles often mark multiple sites because of the scale of this map. So these are the sites we examined. This map shows the distribution of the 180 sites that have undergone some subsurface testing or excavation. And this number was actually a surprise to me. I wouldn't have guessed that that many sites had been excavated. Most of these are shell midden sites where the shell helps preserve bone. This map shows the 92 sites from which faunal remains were recovered. And of these 92 sites, 63, those shown here in this map, were reported and described in sufficient detail for us to understand the recovery and analytical methods used. Of those 63, there were 27 sites where 1/8-inch screen or finer mesh screens were used, producing results we judge as reliable for quantitative analyses based on the comparative collections employed and/or analyst expertise. And of these 27 sites, 22, shown here, that is 81% of those that had been sampled appropriately, contained herring bones, which indicates that when adequate records are used, the archaeological record indicates widespread use of herring. Of the 22 sites that contain herring bones, 7 of these were studied as part of my dissertation research near Angoon, where I used 2mm mesh screens to analyze bulk samples. But that was over 20 years ago. All but one of the Angoon sites, those on Admiralty Island, produced herring bones. Another 7 sites are sites I've been involved in excavating and analyzing over the last 20 years. This indicates that if fine mesh screens are used, herring bones will often be found. And this slide just summarizes the data I just illustrated in the maps in terms of the basic numbers. But the upshot of this is that herring are very much underrepresented in archaeological reports. The earliest herring bones in a Southeast Alaskan archaeological site are from the Chuck Lake site on Hecata Island that was excavated by Robert Ackerman and colleagues in the 1980s. And it was a site that was found when the road was being constructed, so it was found in a road cut. And I guess I'll try this again, see if it'll work. And it won't. Oh, there it goes. Maybe not. But anyhow, the light-colored material under the dark layer there, under the cut log, is where the shell midden is. And this is the oldest shell midden in Southeast Alaska. As I mentioned, it's on Hecata Island, and it's located now away from the ocean shoreline. But at the time that it was occupied, that lake was really part of an estuary and was connected to the ocean. So it was part of a saltwater bay when it was occupied 8,200 years ago. And it's the sea level has receded with isostatic rebound. Oh, I'll mention, go back. The Chuck Lake vertebrate assemblage is the oldest from all of Southeast Alaska, indicating use of herring during the early Holocene time period. It is also a good example of a site that produced a few herring bones even without the use of fine mesh screens. Most records, archaeological records of herring, date to the last 4,000 years. Herring bones have been found in both Kaufman Cove sites, and this shows you site Petersburg 67 under excavation and when we worked here in 2006. As I mentioned, Kaufman Cove is located on the northeastern shore of Prince of Wales Island, adjacent to Clarence Strait. In my experience, herring bones are not evenly distributed throughout shell middens. For example, at this Petersburg 67 site, in just one small sample, I identified 419 herring bones, cranial bones and vertebra from a small grab sample of matrix when a concentration of bone was observed in the field. The sample was not field screened, but transported intact to the University of Oregon laboratory. From the unscreened materials, I picked identifiable bones, not all bone fragments, from the matrix. Sorting out all the bone fragments in this literally handful of matrix would have taken weeks of effort. Instead, I spent several hours just pulling out the herring vertebra and recognizable herring elements. But from this small sample, I took this cup of matrix and figured the density of herring vertebra. The density turned out to be 150 herring vertebra per 100 milliliters of matrix. So that's 115 herring vertebra per half cup of archaeological matrix. This is a remarkably high density of herring and strongly supports the notion that herring is vastly underrepresented in assemblages where quarter-inch or even eighth-inch screens have been relied upon for faunal recovery. In this small sample, a minimum of 7 individual herring were represented. Because so many cranial bones were found, this kind of concentration appears to have been a place where all parts of the herring skeleton were deposited. Whether this was from processing fresh herring for immediate use or whether it represents the disposal of bones from rendering oil is not clear. At a number of sites with relatively abundant herring bones, Pacific cod are also well represented. I could try to point out these sites. Oh, maybe I can't, but this is the Leask site on Annette Island, the Cape Addington site on Noyes Island, a couple of sites near Klawock, the Kaufman Cove sites here. There are 2 sites on Kuyu Island. Over there on the right on the mainland, that's the North Point site. You think that'll work?
Yeah.
It's just too small, Shingo, I think. But I can extend my arm that way. The North Point site, and then the Angoon sites are represented by that single triangle, and there's the Hidden Falls site. And these are all sites where Pacific cod is also really abundant. So this is an association here that I think is meaningful. We believe that the Pacific cod was obtained in early spring between March and April, and these sites may indicate occupation during that same time. Now, the sites that weren't as rich in Pacific cod include the other Kaufman Cove site as well as the Garnes Point site near Angoon, and both of these sites, I think, were occupied in the fall. And one of the activities I think was going on at these sites was the processing of herring for oil. We know Pacific herring is a bellwether species for North Pacific marine ecosystems. It appears that biologists and managers have only a very limited understanding of the longer-term population dynamics and ecology of herring. Since herring were overfished relatively early in the 20th century, archaeology can provide a more complete picture of the spatial distribution and abundance of herring in Southeast Alaska, especially when the archaeological data are integrated with the traditional environmental knowledge Tom Thornton is documenting and the historical harvest levels Fritz Funk has compiled. As is the case for many species, herring stocks are being managed in depleted status, representing a mere fraction of their historical abundance and distribution. This slide shows just some of the places where herring were abundant in the early 20th century. Many long-standing Tlingit towns and villages are associated with important historical herring stocks. We are still in the midst of assessing patterns in herring use over time and space. Auclair and Auclair have described 5 main stocks of herring in Southeast Alaska based on where the fish overwinter. These include Sitka, Craig, Deer, Edelin Island near Wrangell, Ketchikan, and Auk Bay. How representative are these stocks of past herring stocks in the area? One way to investigate this question is to study the ancient DNA contained in the herring bones from archaeological sites. By assessing the genetic variation and comparing this with that of contemporary herring, we could develop a better idea as to the condition and status of the current herring stocks. This is just one of the ways that archaeology can potentially contribute new knowledge to sustainable herring management. Until then, we urge all archaeologists working in the region to use fine mesh screens and recover good samples of herring bones and other small fish bones from archaeological assemblages. These small fish may be the key to understanding the marine ecosystems of Southeast Alaska and documenting the importance of Yaaw. And I'd like to thank these people, of course, Tom Thornton, who's the principal investigator of the project, and Virginia and Butler and Tate Elder from Portland State University, the North Pacific Research Board, Forest Service archaeologists who provided us with reports, including Mark McCallum, Terry Fifield, Jane Smith, Risa Carlson, Martin Stanford, and Myra Gilliam, Joan Dale at the Office of History and Archaeology in Anchorage, my colleague at Oregon who did the microphotography of the herring bones, Gyung-Ah Lee, and then Pete Bowers and his colleagues at Northern Land Use Research, and of course the City of Kaufman Cove. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of commercial fishing for herring in Southeast Alaska. And when I talk about history of commercial fishing, I'm going to be talking about European-style, large-scale harvest, where we have written records. We have other elements of this project that we've heard about earlier that we're dealing with more of the traditional components of herring use. And there's others too. Herring are used for bait in a number of fisheries that are more informally documented. But I'm going to stick to the large-scale European-style harvest from 1878 up to the present time, but I'm going to try to focus on the 19th century where there was a much simpler fishing environment. So I want to try to address the question of how much herring harvest is too much. On a southeast-wide basis, but specifically in this case on a regional basis around northern Chatham Strait. So these are the harvests from all of Southeast Alaska, from all the fisheries from 1878 up to 2008. And you can see the big feature here is the large harvest from the reduction fisheries in the middle of the early to middle part of the 20th century. So we can divide these harvests up into eras. Most recently, this kind of the green area over here, does that look green to you? I guess. Is the Sacro fishery, started up about 1970. The burgundy area down at the bottom are the bait fisheries that have kind of been persistent throughout the entire time. We don't have documentation on all of the harvests, but they're not, not that big. The yellow are the European-style food harvest. But this doesn't include the traditional use of herring on this slide. So I'm going to try to focus on this period from 1878 to about 1915 or 1916, where there are lower harvests down here. Some interesting things that happen down there, primarily because there's only one herring reduction plant. A very important place, Killisnoo, right, an island just off of Angoon. This is a reduction plant. If you're not familiar with that, these are factories where fish are reduced or rendered into oil and fish meal. Oil is usually the very valuable part. The fish meal is just something to do with the rest of it that's of a much lower value. So I want to try to address local depletion around the Killisnoo area. And this is a photograph from the Vincent Soboleff collection down here of the plant after it was fully developed at Killisnoo. And I've found these records from the Alaska State Library just invaluable in trying to understand these fisheries, especially the Soboleff collection. It's just an invaluable tool to have. So this plant is actually kind of unusual that it pops up in Alaska in 1880. Herring were not being rendered to oil elsewhere on the West Coast, and nothing like it was happening here. So it's kind of an anomaly. Herring reduction plants popped up later, much later, in other parts of the West Coast. So we might ask, well, why herring oil? What's going on here in the 1880s? Why did it pop up? Well, I think a lot of the story has to do with whale harvests. This graph, it shows us the unadjusted raw price per gallon of whale oil throughout the 19th century, and you can see it spikes way up during wars. Here's the War of 1812 and the Civil War. This vertical dashed line here is when that Killisnoo plant opens up in 1880. So something's going on. This is after the Civil War spike. Now, this is just the raw price per gallon. When economists get hold of this data, of course, they massage it in mysterious ways that only economists know how to do. And so I don't know how they get consumer price indexes from the 19th century, but somehow they do. And so one economist came up with this upper line here as the trend for whale oil price in the 19th century. Here's that Civil War spike. And so here's our plant opening up a little bit later. And you can see there's just a general increasing trend in whale oil price. The big news is in the bottom, whale oil production. It peaked in 1845 and basically just tanks after that. So pretty much there wasn't much whale oil around. Now, some of the story has to do with the destruction of the whale fleet during the Civil War, but there was a lot of interest in finding replacements for whale oil. Fish oil is not really of the same quality to totally replace it, but there's some things it can be used for. On the East Coast, Menhaden fisheries were developing, and they had rendering plants there. But it hadn't really hit the West Coast. This is really one of the planted Killisnoo was one of the first times we see it. So somebody brought that knowledge and that technology to Alaska, and I haven't identified for sure who that person is, but I'm still trying to track it down. There was an organization sprung up in Portland, the Northwest Trading Company, about this time, and established trading posts around southeast Alaska. Their owners were affiliated with the Oregon Steamship Company that had monthly steamship service to Alaska, and they were pretty much the only show in town. John Vanderbilt, that's a name you may recognize from around here in Juneau, was a purser on one of those boats, and he ends up settling in Wrangell and develops a trading post there, and looks like he starts dabbling in some fish oil. So he's aware that you can do this, and there's a big resource here. And he hooks up with some officials from the Northern Pacific Railroad to form this Northwest Trading Company. And this fellow, Paul Schulze, is actually the Bernard Madoff of the 1880s. He ends up embezzling an enormous quantity of funds from the Northern Pacific Railroad. He commits suicide in 1893, and his embezzlements and debts are something over $1 million in 1893. Value. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, he's mixed up in all this. The point of the Northwest Trading Company is they had a lot of money, and they were interested in developing resources in southeast Alaska. This company's mixed up in the founding of Juneau, and of course, we just heard it is involved in the 1882 attack on Angoon, but that's a whole separate chapter. One feature I'd like to, from a fisheries point of view, of looking at these records, it's very simple. There's only one plant, and we have the records. The Bureau of Commercial Fisheries got very interested in Alaska early on, and they sent the Albatross to the West Coast. And there's a voyage from 1898 where Jefferson Mosier visits the plant at Killisnoo, and he gets fairly complete records from this plant back to its origin. So those are very, very useful. And later on, after the reduction fisheries develop further, George Ronceveld goes back and gets more of these records. So there's a fairly complete set of records. And it's consistent gear. The plant from the beginning used steam-powered tenders. The SS Favorite was the first one. They had the White Wing, the Lincoln, and the Dolphin also that I know of. And Norwegian seines, which were rowed and retrieved by hand onto these other vessels. And this plant at Killisnoo used that technology throughout this early period. The tenders would tow the vessels. These are the rowboats that are used to set and retrieve the seine. And then there's a lot of heavy hand work here. The herring would be offloaded onto the tender. But the large powered vessel was not really involved in harvesting at all, except maybe later on they had steam-powered donkey winches to help braille the herring on board. This is not a Norwegian seine from Killisnoo. It's just an example of what a seine looks like when you set it from a rowboat to go around a school of herring. So in 1931, George Ronceveld looked backwards at all these data, and he was actually interested in this local depletion problem around Killisnoo and tried to put some of this together. This is catch from what he determined to be around the Killisnoo area. I don't know exactly the boundaries on that catch, but it's somewhere in that area. And I want to point out, too, this These reduction fisheries have a focus on non-spawning times. So this is information about where herring are and what they're doing in the fall and the winter, not in the summers to some extent. But it's not really a look at the spring time. So this isn't herring from where they spawn necessarily at Killisnoo, but it's herring that were accessible while they were feeding. In this early period here, Roundsville doesn't have good numbers. I had to kind of pull some things out of the text. I don't know if it's exactly 2,000 tons, but there are a number of indications that what they were doing locally, they were moving around that era. So it sort of starts up here, and it's just a clear, almost linear trend. One of the clearest cases of overharvesting I've seen. We have effort data from this too. So in fisheries, we'd look at catch per unit effort usually, but there's really no need to. This is so dramatic and so profound, there's no need to sort of mix it up with effort. So certainly locally, I mean, if in the area they were harvesting, 2,000 tons is, you could say, is way too much for one of these feeding concentrations for that northern Chatham Strait area. So that kind of puts a bound on what kind of removals herring might sustain. There's another topic that comes up, and that's of prey switching. The oil is the really valuable product from these reduction plants, and when there aren't enough herring around, they'd switch off to other species, usually salmon, to try to fill in the hole. So these are oil production data from that plant at Killisnoo from 1882 out to 1912. And they wrote about having a 380,000, I think, gallon or 350 plant capacity. And it looks like they just about hit that a few times. And so that looks like it's pretty accurate. So we see these sort of waves of production coming through, and we'll be talking about more though in a minute here, looking at the catch. But what's significant here, here's the percent of the oil from the herring. There's just a little bit of it here from 1906 on, and we can see that in 1906 they were only getting, they had to get 40% of their oil from other species. 1906 was the first year there was really a large-scale uprising against these reduction fisheries, and they happened periodically through time. But there were letters written to Congress, and there was a big movement from many sources, salmon trollers, halibut fishermen, I'm sure traditional sources would have been right with them, trying to prohibit this what was viewed as a wasteful fishery that was causing local depletion in the area. So we know that was going on at this time. There was a lot of concern, and the plant couldn't even get their oil from herring. So we know that was one thing going on in the 1906. If we look now at not at oil production, but at the harvest figures from the plant, again, this isn't just from Killisnoo, this is everything they were taking in. You can see these kind of big waves coming through. Some of them have to do with lack of herring, some of them have to do with market conditions. This is that 1906 situation I was just describing, and I'm fairly confident this drop in the catch here has to do with lack of availability of herring, overexploitation, if you will. Two of these others, there's something else going on partially or totally. 1893 was a big financial panic. I hope it was the biggest one the country had experienced to that time. I hope the one we're going through now isn't that bad, but anyway, it was a big deal, and it wouldn't be surprising to find markets not really accepting herring oil at that time. A lot of things were unraveling too. That's when Paul Schulze committed suicide, who had been involved in the Northern Pacific Railroad and initially with the company that ran this plant. In 1888, this other big drop here, there was more of a market condition thing. We can tell from John Vanderbilt's letters, he was involved in managing the company at that time, that their entire 1887 production was sitting in Portland in a warehouse. They couldn't get rid of it. The price was so bad. So there was no incentive to fish very hard for herring in 1888. So I'm not sure if these represent pulses of a year class coming in and overfishing or not, but this one certainly does. But what we do see is these harvests ranging from 5,000 to 10,000 tons. Again, this is northern Chatham Strait, spreading around Admiralty a little bit to the limits of what the steam-powered tenders were doing. Seems to be a kind of an upper cap for what a long-term harvest in that area might be. So George Roosevelt looks at this in 1935. He's looking backwards, and he's pretty definitive in this statement. And he says the failure of this fishery around Angoon may be fairly ascribed to depletion of the stocks from overfishing. This was a really hard thing for a biologist to say in 1935. The industry had sent him there and was funding him to try to figure out how they could keep these big fisheries going. And he's kind of saying, well, no, we can't. And there were a lot of people that didn't even think you could overfish a fishery back then. There was a big argument about, can you do this or can't you? So this statement really stands out, and he's talking specifically about the Angoon area. So if we now flip to that longer record of reduction plants, well, I've just been looking at this era here, when there was only that one plant. In 1918, right after World War I, you can see it just booms. All of a sudden, we have 18 plants fishing. A couple things that I know were going on. I know there was some reduction of oil in the California area. In 1918, they prohibited it. And so there probably was some interest to supply that elsewhere. I'm not sure what all the other factors were. The big boom in British Columbia happened, and Washington happened later, but in 1920, things really, really took off. The plants spread throughout southern Chatham Strait around, this is Baranof Island, this kind of pinkish thing here. There's the plant at Killisnoo. These black dots represent sites where herring plants sprung up that were, many of them as big as Killisnoo and more modern. So the fishing power was just tremendous. They had access to internal combustion engines. We started seeing powered methods to assist retrieving of the nets. It was just a phenomenal growth in fishing power. And this is just kind of a crude overview of all the catch from that period. If you just look for where the bright colors are, you can see where most of the catch is, except ignore this. This blue thing is actually a very low catch. So we have large vessels that have gear that can fish off Cape Omni and the outer coast, deal with the heavier surf conditions out there, some fishing at Sitka Sound, and some off west coast of Prince of Wales. But the southern Chatham is where most of the plants were and where most of those removals came from. So we see this big boom happen in the 20s and the 30s, and then it just crashes. And these kind of spikes in here are what sent Roosevelt on his expeditions. But the fisheries actually closed totally in 1940. And again, this is just a really unusual thing to do. That just didn't happen, where fisheries were closed in that era, and people didn't think it was possible, but it was so bad they just outright closed it. Then the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries instituted a system of fish quotas after that, and that's the red line that you see here going up and down. The green line is just the number of plants. It obviously goes down during the closure, and they didn't all hang on. There just wasn't enough herring for them all to be profitable. The quotas, they didn't really have the ability to estimate abundance back then, so they had quotas that would change in response to what the fishermen were catching, basically. After the catches already went down where they couldn't get more, the quota would come down, and then it would slowly go back up, as long as the catches were going up. But you see the red line kind of lags the catches. So it probably wasn't a very effective system of regulation, but it did constrain the catches somewhat at the top end. Fishery ends in 1966. What happened there was really a market condition that put the final end to it. The Peruvian anchovetas fisheries developed from South America, and they really flooded the market with very cheap fish meal, and the Alaska plants just could not compete. One other aspect I just recently became aware of was the magnitude of the shore plant whaling in Southeast Alaska, and I think that's a piece of the puzzle here. It was really just a flash in the pan, 1907 to 1913. Didn't last very long. In fact, most of the action happens in 1912 and 1913. There was new technology at the time, long-range exploding harpoon guns mounted on the bows of steam-powered whaling ships. The ships they had access to internal combustion engines, but they usually wanted bigger ships to do this. In 1912, the Port Armstrong plant took 314 whales into their shore plant, and they were fished best. Most of these came from right in that area. The next year they took about half that many. The year after that they basically couldn't find any to catch. So they shifted their operation to floating processors, and they end up in the western Gulf of Alaska. And that wasn't the only plant. This is their shore plant at Port Armstrong. You can see there's a whale floating out here, and I think there's one being drug up onto the rendering place there. This was a pretty big investment for a 2-year operation, so somebody put a lot of money into this. Okay, and at any rate, it was It was a massive investment, and so one has to think what happens when you remove that much predation pressure from herring. And so this happens in 1912, massive harvest of whales. In looking back at these data, I start thinking, whether this was even a typical herring ecosystem to begin with. It may have been a massively perturbed one by the removal of these top-end predators. So when we sit here now in 2009 and we look backwards, we often are tempted to use this as a reference point for what a massive overexploitation might look like for herring in Southeast Alaska. That might be off base if the whole system was already massively perturbed by this removal here. Whales were scarce during this period, but they've rebuilt now. So it's a fairly different environment that we're looking at. So I'll leave you with this photo of the poor little herring there by the red arrow contemplating its fate in northern Chatham Strait in 2008. As we think about how to try to work these, a larger ecosystem picture into our view of fisheries management. And I just want to say I've really enjoyed this historical process of learning about these older reduction plants. We had a chance to sit down with Walter Soboleff as part of one of our interviews that Tom was involved in, and I learned a lot from him. He actually worked at this plant. So if there's any of you out there that have information about that plant or any of the other reduction plants in Southeast Alaska, I would love to talk to you. So thank you, and Gonos Chish.
Good afternoon. So as you see, the title of my presentation today is How Kamuichat Became Phantom Fish, a review of Japan's herring cultural history. This is really an outline of Japanese herring culture history, because what I'm trying to talk is like a Japanese version of what Fritz, Tom, and Madonna just said. So basically, the volume of information is so enormous. So I'll just quickly overview my slide, and I will focus on just 3 points that Tom and Fritz and Madonna mentioned. One is the shifted baseline that Tom mentions. And Madonna talked about the issue of screen size and how herring is archaeologically underrepresented. And Fritz mentioned how much is too much. So I'll just focus on those 3 parts. So Pacific herring is is being fished around here, and also Pacific herring is available in the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk. And what I'm trying to do is, basically the comparative, historical ecology of Pacific herring, just, to see how, how much similarities and, differences exist between, Southeast herring fishery and the Japanese herring fishery. And this, the left picture is, the one of the historical picture from Hokkaido, Japan. And the right one is, I stole it from Tom's slide before. So Tom mentioned about herring as a super abundant gibbon, and here I have a quotation from abundant herring from Hokkaido. The beach was littered with eggs, milked, and the body of fish washed up onto shore. And the water was so crowded with herring that a pole could almost stand unsupported. Anyone not too old, too young, or too sick joined in the business for hauling fish with net, basket, and the bare hands, leaving only the aged and infirm at home. Everyone, elders, councillors, vassals, lady, men sunburned, and handmaiden, heads for the beach, rolls up their sleeves, and join in the catch, with no distinction left between lord and townsman. And this is what I'm very interested in, because Hokkaido is a homeland of indigenous Ainu people, And Ainu people call actually salmon a kamuichep, means god fish in Ainu language. But actually, I learned that in Ainu people, who lived in the west coast, Hokkaido, actually called herring kamuichep. So this indicated how important herring was. So I get interested in the significance of herring in Northwest Pacific. And the Ainu Mosil is the place name for the, where Ainu people lived. And Ainu actually means human, and the Mosil means land or words, but that simple translation doesn't carry the significance or symbolic meaning of those words. And actually, Ainu Mosil should be translated the quiet land inhabited by humans. And Ainu Mosil, the place Ainu people live, was stretched to Hokkaido Island and the southern part of Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. And those Ainu people live in the northern part of Japan. And on the left side, you see the map of Hokkaido. And this is the map of Hokkaido with, a major fishing village name. And if you see, it's kind of hard to see. It's very small, okay. In the southwest tip of Hokkaido Island, used to be called Wajinchi, means Japanese land. And the rest of land was called Ezochi, means Ainu land. So Hokkaido Island was really the homeland of Ainu people. And this is a brief map of herring spawning areas of the 1930s and the 1960s. And you can see the herring spawning area stretched to the west coast of Hokkaido Island and also east part of Hokkaido coast. But I want to emphasize that this is the data from the 1930s to 1960s. So we don't know how much herring spawning area was wide before. The herring and archaeology in Hokkaido and Ainu Mosil, there's the lines of evidence showing that herring fishing was dating back to the 5500 BP, and there's evidence of intensive herring fishing, especially the southwest and the west coast of Hokkaido and Sakhalin. And archaeologists also argue that the influence of herring fishing onto the settlement pattern in the Tomakomai region, which face on the Pacific coast side, and the population increase. But usually Ainu culture, archaeologically and also probably ethnographically, are highlighted as a salmon culture. And of course, salmon was important, but I want to emphasize that herring was also important. And this is what Madonna said. Sometimes herring was underrepresented in the archaeological record. And this is a map from Toyohiro Nishimoto, the renowned archaeologist doing Hokkaido archaeology. And this dot indicates major archaeological sites, and the red dot indicates archaeological site with few herring bones. But again, I want to say these are major archaeological sites that Nishimoto picked. So I don't know. For example, there might be the minor archaeological site with a lot of herring bones. And this is the chart from Taka Osato, another archaeologist. And this is the comparison of a proportion of fish bones in Ainu archaeological sites. And the vertical stripe indicates herring. And if you see the 4 lines, 4 bars with red dot, you can see that actually the herring was quite abundant in some archaeological sites. And I'm going to turn to the ethnology. Actually, so far I haven't been able to find much literature on herring fishing by indigenous Ainu people. I just found so far 2 literatures, and this is one of them. Drawing by Mashiho Chiri, the Ainu scholars. And this is a drawing, according to the record, it said the drawing was made in 1700. And you can see the Ainu people actually fish a lot of herring with pretty like a labor organized, activities, rather than, the Machiho Chile and draw the dip nets. But here in this drawing, you can see the Ainu people engaged in like intensive, herring fishing. And this is a map of Ainu geographic names related to herring fishing. And you can see the dot concentrated on the west coast of Hokkaido. And this is one of the example of Ainu geographic names. The Hiroki Karubushi. There's the two red dots on the land. These are like a Japanese shrine and Ainu shrine. This is the shoreline, coastal line showing that the allotment of fishing areas. And one of them is Hiroki Karubushi. It's the Ainu words and the Ainu geographic names. And actually, Hiroki means herring, and the Kal means to catch, Wush, always. The E means place. So this geographic names, Hiroki Karubushi, indicate how Ainu people, the fact that Ainu people used to fish here, and there are a lot of herring here. And I want to mention a little bit on the Japanese people and herring fishing. Unfortunately, I cannot see the 5 Japanese letters here, but actually, in Japanese language, we call herring nishin. And there are 5 writing patterns to write herring. And the first one is called nishin, but that means not fish. There's 2 parts of that. The character nishin consists of 2 parts, and the left part means fish, and the right part means not. And I believe that word, means fish not, because actually herring used to be used for taxation in linear putative rice field. And another letter means like 2 parents, 2 bodies, fish to select, fish is, I'll skip in here probably. And this is a brief outline of Japanese herring history in Hokkaido. Just keep the map. And again, when I show you guys the map of Hokkaido, you can see that Japanese people live in only southwest tip of Hokkaido. But Japanese colonization expanded with chasing herring, because Japanese people fish herring a lot in the southern part of Hokkaido, and the herring resource is getting declining, so they start moving to north. And as Japanese people expanded to the left part of Hokkaido Island, probably the same situation happening in the United States. A lot of geographic names changed to Japanese names. This is one of the example. One of the geographic names in the west coast is Kumaushi, and that's from Japanese Ainu language. Kuma means drying poles and beans. That doesn't necessarily mean that the kuma means drying poles specifically for herring, but kuma in Ainu language means drying pole, and the ush means again always place. So Ainu geographic names, Kumaushi means where the drying poles always existed. But that place name has changed to a Japanese word. And phonetically, it's the same or similar, Kumaishi. So the Kumaishi is the current geographic names for this town. But in Japanese letter, the Kumaishi actually means bare stone. So the meaning Kumaushi that attached to this place originally has been lost. So changing the geographic names had the risk of loss of local ecological knowledge or traditional environmental knowledge, and also culture loss and the language loss. Oops. Also, Japanese colonization began expanded from west part of Japan and ended to the whole island of Hokkaido. And I want to show this chart again because the two bars on the left, Hamanaka site and another site, these are sites located on the west coast of Hokkaido. And you don't see much, much evidence of a herring in here. And I will say this is because Japanese people took the herring fishing site a lot. And if we focus on Ainu culture or the salmon culture and neglecting the importance of herring, we don't, at the center, will neglect we might misinterpret the archaeological evidence. So in this chart, we can see that there are a lot of herring bones on the Pacific Coast side of archaeological site and Okhotsk Ocean side. That's because Ainu people live there a bit longer compared to the west coast of Hokkaido. And the Japanese colonization expanded to Hokkaido Island, and Japanese modernization beginning at late 19th century is actually founded on the exploitation of Ainu labor and the herring. And the herring meal fertilizer for the agricultural development of Western Japan was a major part of, for Japan, the Imperial Japan securing the food resources. And all herring fertilizer were exported from Hokkaido. And the herring meal fertilizer in Hokkaido was cheap. And why? Because Ainu people were exploited as basically like a slave. And also abundance of herring is one of the reasons why herring meal fertilizer produced in Hokkaido was cheap. And Japanese herring fishery really expanded in the modern time. And one time in 1879, as you can see, 975,000 tons of herring was harvested. And that's a record high. And these are some of the pictures of Japanese herring fishing. But the phrase, asked how much is too much? So Japanese herring fishery corrupted completely in 1958. So you can see that how those is clearly, herring populations declined. So why herring population declined? Overproduction, overfishing, or the spawning area, the habitat area was disrupted, or climate change. I found this news article, which was in 1955. It talks about global warming. So Japanese people in 1955 attribute decline of herring population to global warming rather than overfishing. And then now in Japan, we imported a lot of herring from this part of world, like here. And now in Japan, herring is called maboroshi no sakana, it's a phantom fish. And but still, Japanese people had a lot of the cultural, emotional attachment to herring. So restoration efforts for phantom fish has been done in the last 10 years. And one of the major one is herring hatchery. And compared to the historical number of herring production, this number is quite small. But you can see that the number is increasing little by little. So conclusion, I know just archaeological and geographic name studies suggest that herring fishing was actually a major part of cultural history in Hokkaido or inland. And I want to say, what can we learn from this, traditional commons, Japanese herring fishery? I'll just stop here probably. Thank you. Last station.
All right, thank you, Shingo. A lot to think about, a lot of history. Now we need some wisdom to pull it all together. So I want to call on two of our elders to give some comments if they want to extend some of what they've seen or really focus on whatever they think is important about herring. I'll call up first Ethel Makinen, who's the Natha of the Tlingit clan in Sitka. And she's a fluent speaker of Tlingit, been a big advocate for the language and, all cultural resources really, and I consider her among my own teachers. And then after Ethel makes her remarks, I'd like to call on another one of my teachers, Harold Martin from Cake, who is a longtime chairman, president of the Southeast Native Subsistence Commission, has been the president of Cake Tribal Corporation, and is also a Duck Dane Tan from Cake.
When I was asked, I said, I'm not a herring fisherman, but I know what it means to me as a Tlingit. When I was a child, we used to say, Auditlok, gook. That means the heron spawned, the heron spawned. It was our food, as we grew up. Our fathers laid the branches where we got the heron, and the whole village. I came from Sitka, where the whole village was crowded with people. Today, we hardly see anyone there in what we called our village, and it was referred to as the ranch too. Today, I worry about what's happening with our food. When you see all the herring boats in Sitka, when we were kids, the only boat that we saw that fished them was for the Sitka cold storage. Do you remember that? This was they put them up for a bait in them days, but today it's a very big thing, and our people are fighting so that it won't disappear from us, that'll be there. I know as I had my children, when it came to this time now, because they are fishing, when we were leaving home on Tuesday, it was just crowded with those big boats that fish the heron. As I got my kids, I had 5 sons and 1 daughter. But I knew where my boys were at this time. I lived over Mount Edgecombe for 19 years, and the beach shorelines over Mount Edgecombe was just crowded with the young fellows fishing the heron. They took them home so their parents could cook it. As we gathered heron, it was of 3 types. Hauda'a, which was on the branches. Neh, which was on the grass, hair grass. Mega?
Hair kelp.
hair kelp, and Yaaw, which was a big kelp that they spawned on. Today, you have to have permission, you have to have a license to get it.
Fishing license.
Fishing license to get it. Today, when we get the herring eggs, we use it to put them in salad, several different ways, but we call it kagaktushakar yayagi, meaning that we are going to blanch our herring eggs, so you blanch them. What a treat, because it was done with seal oil. Before the spawn, everybody was making their seal oil so that they can be ready for this time of the year. The Kiksadi have names that Tom was speaking about earlier when he showed the totem pole and the Herring Rock, and they have stories. The women, the Kiksadi women are called Kahacha Shah, which meant when the herons went up, in waves, they made a lot of noise, and it's called Kahacha. So the Kiksadi ladies are called Kahacha Shah. And the Herring Rock was down below by the coal storage. Now, part of it sits by the Sitka Sound, Nakahiti. That's a story that goes with that also. It was a lady that was laying on the rock, and she had long hair, and her hair was floating, and as she napped, the heron spawned on her hair. There's a big story that goes with it, but I don't know how it goes, otherwise I'd tell you. But all those things happen during the heron spawn. Also, there's the Kiksadi have names that go with this. One is Yaaw. Tom was telling you about the name Yaaw that the seagulls gave to. I haven't heard that, Tom, so kind of makes me. One of Isabel's grandsons named that Yaaw, and Irene Jimmy gave Robbie Craig, who was supposed to have been on your program, the name Yaaw Shawat, meaning heron woman. She worked real hard on the Heron Commission. I think they're not here because the boats are all in Sitka fishing. It was a very important time for us as we grew up. It's before the freezer time for us when we were kids. And at that time, the sun used to be out and warm, and you could see that the people were putting the heron eggs on. You see all the little islands around Sitka, and everybody had their own island that they'd put these branches out to dry, so they'd dry them. And during the winter, they'd put them into the salt water to bring them back and cook, or it was good just as it was to dip in seal oil. I remember all these things because it was our duty as children to help our parents to do it. Everybody had their own duties to do as children. You had, before you could play out a lot of these sins as they came up, you had to help because it was your winter. I see Nancy Davis Yell back there, and she asked us to do just exactly what we're doing today with the young fellow over there that spoke before me. At that time, too, I didn't know what I was going to say about heron, but I do the best I can because that's what we grew up on, our food. All the fish that you saw on the charts here is our food, our subsistence food, as we call it today, but all our lives we grew up on what was around us, which was very plentiful. And with that, I'd like to turn over for a little while to Roby, and because Roby, her husband, really works on this Heron Commission also.
Kagwantan shawu ayachat, sheet kakechat yati, a chuch nas ach, yudu asak, look nachadich city. My name is Kutlek, and I'm from Sitka, and I'm married into the Tluknachadi because my husband Nasach is from that clan. I wanted to speak a little short time about customary trade. For about 15 years, I was the one that went out to get the herring eggs for my family while my husband was earning a living. He's retired now, and the shoe's on the other foot. Now I'm earning a living, and he's getting the herring eggs. I was taught how to harvest eggs by my husband's great uncle, Jack Lucky. He came to Sitka one spring and couldn't find anybody to go out with him to get eggs to take back to Juneau. So I had all been asking questions, and we came to an agreement that he would show me how to do it. So we went down the beach in front of our house. We dragged down some hemlock branches. He showed me how to tie rocks. We went down at low tide, set them, left them there. He taught me to stay out of the sandy part where the fresh water came down, go to the bigger rocks where the fish will be more likely to lay eggs where there's no sand. And we harvested a couple of big, bunches of branches, and he took a bunch home. And that was my first experience with customary trade. He taught me, and he got to take home some eggs. And so after that, every year I made a point to go out and get eggs. And after a while, my husband trusted me with the boat, and I could even take the boat out by myself. About 12 or maybe 15 years ago, I don't really remember how long ago, it was so long ago. A lady called me up out of the blue one spring and wanted to know if she could come and help me get fish eggs, and I always say yes to that question. So she came on down from Atlin, BC, and first time I met her, Mary Anderson. Mary, can you stand? Gidahan. And she came down, and we went out and got our fish eggs. Gunashchish. And every year since that time, she has come down from Atlin to get fish eggs, and she is my interior connection. In between that, besides getting herring eggs for Mary, I try to gather enough eggs that our family can share with our relatives in other communities. For many years after Jack Lucky passed, I made sure to send his wife Ruth a 50-pound box of eggs. When I send out eggs, I pay the freight. Unless someone wants to help me with the freight, they send me a check back. If they don't, it's my gift of love to them. It's very expensive lately, but that's my gift of love to them. And I send to mostly relatives. Once in a while, someone will make a deal with me and say, I'll send you something else if you send me some fish eggs. And I'm very happy with that arrangement. Others have more formal agreements, and maybe they negotiate it every year because the price of gas goes up every year. But my choice of trade and barter is to just go ahead and send what they ask for, and they send me back what they have. And I've always been very pleased and happy with that. And I know there's other people that do that, but that's just an old custom that I learned to take part in. And I'm very glad to have Mary as my friend, because she has given our family so much more than just encouragement and help in gathering eggs. She's a fluent speaker, and she's an incredible role model for my daughter, and I just love her so much. I don't know what else to say, I know there's lots more to talk about trade, barter, and what it means and how it's used, but that's something you can't really explain everything about in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. It's something you discover along the way as you practice the custom. So I would like to encourage other people to don't hesitate to learn how to barter and trade. It's the most ancient economy in the world. And today's Americans don't have a clue. I believe the Native Alaskans and perhaps a few other Native American groups know what it means to trade or barter. I think they do it in Mexico pretty good, I've heard. Okay, Dostia has more.
One of the things that our people worry about is when they lay their branches, you know, they can't stand guard over them, but since herring fisheries have showed up in Sitka, a lot of them lose their branches because it goes other places. And that makes them feel bad because it's a lot of work to lay those branches, as Roby was explaining. But they don't do this only for themselves. They do share, and all our lives our people have been like that. They share with other people. They share with the elders that can't get it. And Sitka Tribe of Alaska has a food gatherer person, and they share their whatever they get with all the elders and those who can't go by boat, those that are disabled and everything else. This that we're talking about today mean an awful lot to my people. Not only the Haidas or the, you know, when I went to Metlakatla one year, it impressed me how they hardly had the hair spawn, so they got it on the seine. Somebody calling me. But I'm happy that you asked me, Tom, to be here, and I hope I shared enough of my culture, and I hope everybody that's here understands that. I think they're calling me so I can go to bingo.
Uh-oh.
Good at cheese.
Oh, you got your own, sorry.
Am I on?
Iikuha.
Sheesh. My name is Harold Martin. I am a Tlingit. I come from the Raven Moiety. My clan is the Duckdane Town. My house is the Yeshkudi Hit, which is the Raven's Nest house. I'm a child of the Unyeti clan, and I'm a grandchild of the Kagwantan clan. I was born and raised in Cake, but my traditional homeland is Huna. And I grew up in our traditional subsistence way of life. Traditional ecological knowledge is gained from long periods of observation. In the case of rural residents, it is years of observation. I will be 75 next year, so I've observed a lot of change in my lifetime. It seems that there's great concern about the depletion of herring stocks, which is very important to our way of life. I had hoped that Clarence Jackson would be here to speak about the Cake area, but since he didn't show, I'll hit a little bit about herring stocks around the Cake area. There are several places where herring was harvested around Cake. The Port Camden, which is not just south of Cake, is a big area, and there was a lot of herring in there, and they spawned in some of the little inlets, but they seem to stay there all year round. They didn't come out during the day; they came out at night. When at night on a calm night, when you anchored up, you could hear something like a waterfall. And I asked one time, "What is that?" They said, "That's herring." I got involved with the A&B in 1964, and we talked to the Fish and Game Department and introduced resolutions to stop the herring fisheries in Port Camden. all that fell on deaf ears, so today there's no herring in Port Camden, small schools here and there. Up at the Portage, just south of the boat harbor, there used to be a lot of herring there. They spawned in there. They don't do that anymore. Up in Hamilton Bay, there's certain areas, 2 or 3 areas where herring spawned. A place called Scotty's Garden, where as kids in grade school, on weekends, we used to get in our rowboats and row over there and trolled because the king salmon came in for the herring. Well, they don't come back there anymore either. At Cape Bendel, in the mid-40s and early 50s, we used to go out there as a fish camp, set up a fish camp there. The people from Cape would go out there and hand troll until the 4th of July. The herring were thick there. On a calm day, the sun shining, when the herring came up on the surface, it sounded like a big waterfall. And it came up so thick it looked like you could run across the top of them, all the way from the shore to Turnabout Island, all the way across to Point Gardner. Not long after that, there were seine boats all over that area, herring seine boats. The herring reduction plant in Washington Bay was in operation at that time. In the mid-50s, most of that herring was gone. The seine boats left, and they shut down the Washington Bay herring reduction plant. So you can see there's a big trail of depletion around the Cape area. In the Cape Mendel area, I go back there and troll from time to time with rod and reel, and you don't see herring there anymore. You see small schools here and there, but not like it used to be. In the Juneau area, I got out of the Marine Corps in 1960 and got married the same year, and we moved to Juneau in 1961. In 1962, we went out to Indian Cove in the springtime. There used to be a herring pond out there, and before that, we used to come all the way from Cape to pick up fresh herring for halibut fishing. And but the herring spawned in Indian Cove, and it was so thick on boulders there that you could literally peel it off the boulders with your hand. Well, they don't come back anymore. In 1980, we moved back here again after graduating from college. I did my graduate studies out here at the university. But during that time, we would go down to Hawk Bay and catch herring down there, and the herring were so large that you had to split them to smoke them. At the same time, there was a herring fishery out at Berners Bay, and they eventually fished out Berners Bay. The herring don't come back anymore like they used to. At Hawk Bay, they're small little herring that've been there for several years. They're coming back, but very slowly, and not like they used to be. Up at the ferry terminal, there used to be a spawn there. They seemed to be a special stock. They were smaller herring, and they'd get up there in a big minus tide, and they'd spawn up there. And there's a big tidal pool there that when the tide went out, outgoing tide, there a lot of people used to go up there and get their herring with dip nets. But I'd go down there and bucket and get the herring out of the herring pond or the pond and just fill up a bucket. They just had to be they just have to be just the right size for trolling, hand trolling. So I always got my share. But Berners Bay was fished out. The herring aren't coming back. You know, there's because you know it just seems to set some kind of trends on where we're going. You know, in today's world, you know, you can be sure there will be people attempting to sustain economies from timber long after plastic alloys replace wood. Manufacturers of gasoline-powered automobiles will be attempting to market their products long after it is rendered obsolete by solar-powered engines or some other environmentally benign form of propulsion. The same is true of economics based on fish and game populations. As long as there is one 60-pound king salmon fish swimming around or one 10-foot brown bear left, someone will be going after it for profit. To the native people, Alaska is our home. We are born here and die here in our homeland. To newcomers and others, it is simply a storehouse full of resources to be commercialized and exploited. By those statements, you don't have to guess how I feel about the current management of our herring or other resources. We've watched our natural resources deplete for years. But as Native people, in our hearts, in my heart, this land still belongs to us. And we take care of these lands as though it still belonged to us. The traditional protocols are still there, and the unwritten laws are still there, and we pass it on. I've taught it to my children. I'm hoping they'll pass it on to their children. I have always felt that if we integrated traditional ecological knowledge into Western science, we could cut their work in half, and we would get along much better. With that, I'll cut it off.
Ganesh Chish, and thank you so much for this presentation. I was really captured by your PowerPoint and the intensity by which you've researched this, because it certainly is, we are the food we eat, and I stand here as one of those who enjoy the herring. I have to say, as I said earlier this morning, that there begs to be the other side of the story told. My Tlingit name is Eshkuk. I'm Tekoidi brown bear. And we migrated from the Kuyu Islands up around Port Alexander up into Sitka, where we spotted the beautiful Mount Edgecombe. And for many of our Tekoidi, that emblem is on our regalia that tells that story of migration, if you will. So I certainly stand here as a voice of the past, saying that we're very well familiar with Sitka. I have my lineage there. In fact, if my mother had stayed there in her 9 months of pregnancy, I would have been born in Sitka. And so I claim that area too as my ancestral grounds. I spoke with my husband and sons who are in Sitka right now, waiting for an opening. And they put a call out on Channel 16 asking for the native fishermen to speak up and shout out their names. And I have a list of those names on this pad of paper, and I will call those out. But I want to say this in terms of the response to the PowerPoint and what I heard here today, that there was a question, how much is too much to harvest, and also what is the impact of the predation? We know that the whales have been increasing at 5% a year, and certainly, so that question intrigues me. In terms of the question, how much is too much harvest, I understand that the harvest level now, or the biomass right now, is between 70 and 85,000. And so the Fish and Game set the harvest take at 20%. So right now, they have set the harvest intake at 15,000 tons, when the biomass, again, is 85,000. The history, and you can take it or leave it, because as a fisherman, I take it or leave it when I get Fish and Game data too, that it has been steadily increasing since the 60s, and it's robust, they say. In your PowerPoint, it showed that when the harvest level way back at the turn of the century was 80,000 tons, that there were 20 plants in operation for the oil. Today, there are a few plants, but primarily 1 or 2 in Sitka, and yet the harvest level is very high. Certainly, we have to and I'll be one native voice as a permit holder and representing many families that are, or at least 17 Alaska Natives, one more fishery that we've been pushed out of for many, many reasons beyond our control, that we have to balance this with respect to the fact that we're part of this food chain as well. I'm intrigued by it, and I think it's going to take everyone to have their lights on bright to get to the bottom of this, because what we're hearing is if the food goes, then we go, and we don't want that to happen. My family's in this fishery because we bought into the Joe Demert estate, who has since passed. But I'll call out some of the names, and then I'll close with that. I don't have any other questions other than say that please remember that this morning there was a call about displacement and our men being lost in this sea of change. And let's not forget the men, because it's nothing short of castration if you close down fisheries. We need to get together as a people and talk about, aside from scientists and you name it, we need to talk together, because I don't want my sons on the beach and displaced. Enough has happened. Take a look at Hoona. Take a look at all our communities. The question, my daughter leaned over and said, the question really is, how can we get our men back to work? How can we get them back to work? Because it's there on the sea that my sons have understood who they are as Tlingit men and Aleut men. The names are Ronald John, the late Ronald John, St. Peter, Joe Demert, Sonny Inlow, all three who have walked into the woods, Frank Hayward, Gary Sudam, Steve Sudam, Leo Wood, Len John, Charlie Skolka, Leonard Skeek, Royce Haywood, Johnny Johansson, Nick Johansson, Archie Demert, Frank Demert, Harry Jackson, Art Demert, Gary Demert, Tony Sanderson, Jerry Peel, John Morris, Kevin Kristovich, Norval Nelson Jr., Norval Nelson III, Nicholas Nelson, Aquino Brinson, Dominic Brinson, Nils Nelson, Pat Venner, Mark Jack, Nick Johansson, Mike Williams, Larry Demert, Lawrence Young, Lexi Gamble, Curtis Demert, Jamie Tishy, George Demert, Ivan McAllister, Leroy John, Leo Woods, Canute Felipe, Carlin Cadiente, Steve Demert, Wayne Alex, Andy Gamble, Benny Johnson. The last 20 have asked me to shout their names out. They're there now. Coming out of a cold winter, we also need to feed our families. We also need to pay our bills. We're the very few left of native indigenous fishers, and if you lose us, what really do you have in terms of your tradition? My sons might as well. Well, I won't say it. And I know that you would hold my sons as your own sons, and I ask you to do that. Ganesh Chish.
Thank you.
Last week, my son went out on he's both looking at the heron, you know. I think not only do we worry about the fishermen fishing all our heron, but he said that there are so many sea lions waiting. It looked like it was just a road, how many sea lions there was in wait. Besides that, there was a whale. So that's what we're looking at today. It surprised him when he saw that, first time he saw that. Good enough cheese.
And also, I'm not sure I understood the whole point that she was making, but it's not just 17 people out on the water trying to get herring for their families. There's hundreds from Sitka, and long ago, we're told that there was 15,000, maybe 20,000 that would come to Sitka to get eggs for their families. And we work just as hard with less equipment than the commercial fishermen. We have to work so hard, and we have little bitty boats, and we have to compete with the big boats to get our eggs. And they want us to go around them. It should be the other way. We should have our traditional food first. We should be able to go out and get our food, and then they could have a commercial harvest. And that's how a lot of people feel as well.
As we speak, the areas have been enclosed. That is happening with the influence of Sitka tribes of Alaska and the native fishermen arguing for us. They're not asking for more. They're also part of the voice that are saying there's accountability. Let's keep up the standard high. That is happening. They are working. They are your voice there too. And I didn't say 17, they're just the permit holders. If you pull this fishery out, not just Sitka is incurred economically, but all of Southeast Alaska, but the footprint of this fishery is large, and it's not just Sitka. And again, I speak as Eshko.
Shish, that lady right here had a comment.
Okay. I don't think I was advocating shutting down the fisheries. I was talking mostly about my problems with the management of the fisheries. I based my comments on the fact that for the last 2 or 3 years, the local people in Sitka haven't had their share of herring spawn. I know I used to get on there and get my herring spawn. The last 2 years, I haven't got any. So.
It took our family 2 weeks this year, and every day going out round and round and round. It shouldn't be that hard. And to me, that's part of the big pictures that says there's a problem. And the subsistence fishermen, the local people who gather eggs are not part of the problem, because we take this much. The biggest part is the huge commercial harvest on a delicate resource. The whales are increasing. They eat tons and tons a day, and they're not being counted.
Sea lions.
They don't count them in their equations. The sea lions, they all chase the herring in because there's nothing else out there to eat. The only big base fishery left for the wild mammals on the ocean are the herring schools, so they all rush into Sitka Sound to get what they can get while they can get it, along with they're in competition with commercial fishing, and the fishing game is not taking that into account, and that's what Sitka tribe has a problem with, and what we've been trying to deal with the fishing game for 15 years. We've been trying to do it politely and thinking of everybody in the equation, and it's getting more and more delicate, and we're scared to death that there's going to be another crash like there was in the 40s. And so we're all looking for answers, but we have to look at the big picture for everybody, and we agree on that.
But I just want to leave with one statement, that the biomass is 85,000 tons today. There's a 20% harvest level of that amount. That is managing on herring, on conservation. That is a very, I believe, a very modest and fair percentage to determine the harvest, 20% of the harvest level. And again, if it falls at 25,000 or less, the fishery closes. Boom, it's over. Let me just say this, and I won't say anything else. That as we speak, there should have been an opening today, but because of the advocacy of Sitka tribes of Alaska, they closed the fishery because the herring have moved into the areas closest to the Sitka beach. And I can only imagine if I remained in Sitka, how I would feel on the beach, and I take that when I'm there. I take that, and I respect that. But again, let's not move in terms of speaking fear, when really the fear is that we do not talk together. I believe that we should, the native fishermen right now are coming together to form a group so they can be heard among their brothers and sisters. To speak reasonably, and carefully, and respectfully.
I just want to point out, we actually did interview fishermen in the fishery for their traditional knowledge. And some of them are quite candid. I didn't quote too many in my own presentation about issues, but most fishermen are obviously concerned for sustainability if they've been in the fishery for any period of time. And I think some of them have suggested that it really needs to be done right in Sitka because it hasn't been done right in some other places where they're no longer fishing. And so I think everybody sees that side of it. So let us maybe close there, and thank you again, panelists, for a very interesting set of papers and responses, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, kushish.